Ethan Miller sat on the hard wooden chair in the waiting room, and his hands would not stop shaking. He looked around at all the other students who had come for the piano audition at Eastwood Classical Academy. They all looked so different from him. The girls wore expensive dresses with designer shoes. The boys had tailored suits and perfect haircuts that probably cost more than Ethan's entire wardrobe. Ethan looked down at his own clothes. His jeans were faded and had a patch near the knee, where his mother had sewn up a tear. His sneakers were old, the kind you could buy at a discount store for $20. His shirt was clean but wrinkled, despite his mother's best efforts with their old iron. He clutched his sheet music in his hands, and the papers were already getting damp from his nervous sweating. This was Eastwood Classical Academy, the most prestigious music school on the East Coast. The building looked more like a palace than a school. When Ethan had first walked through the massive front doors, he felt completely out of place. Everything around him screamed wealth and privilege, and he was just a boy from the mountains of West Virginia with a dream that seemed impossible. Ethan had grown up in a small town in Appalachia where most people worked in coal mines or at the few remaining factories that hadn't closed down yet. His father had died in a mining accident when Ethan was 8 years old. The memory of that day still hurt like a fresh wound. One morning his father had kissed him goodbye and gone to work, and he never came home again. After that, it was just Ethan and his mother, Sarah Miller. She worked at a local diner called Maggie's Place, serving coffee and eggs to truck drivers and the few tourists who passed through their town on the way to somewhere more interesting. She worked double shifts whenever she could, standing on her feet for 12 hours at a time. Coming home exhausted with aching legs and a smile she forced onto her face for her son's sake. They lived in a small trailer on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but Sarah kept it clean and filled it with as much love as she could manage. The walls were thin, and in winter the cold seeped through every crack. In summer, the heat was almost unbearable, but it was home. And Ethan never complained because he knew his mother was doing everything she possibly could. Money was always tight. There were weeks when they ate beans and rice for every meal. There were months when Sarah had to choose between paying the electric bill or buying Ethan new shoes for school. She always chose the shoes. She would sit in the dark before she would let her son go to school in shoes with holes in them. School was difficult for Ethan, but not because of the academics. He was actually very smart and got good grades without trying too hard. The difficulty came from the other kids. They made fun of his accent, calling him a hillbilly and a redneck. They laughed at his clothes and the fact that he brought his lunch in an old bread bag instead of a proper lunchbox. They excluded him from their groups and their games, making him feel invisible. But Ethan found something that made all of that bearable. He found music. It happened on a Sunday morning when Ethan was 9 years old. His mother had started taking him to the small Baptist church at the end of their road. She wasn't particularly religious, but she thought it would be good for Ethan to have some community, some place where people knew his name and cared about him. The church was tiny, barely holding 50 people on a good Sunday. The building was old and needed repairs that the congregation could never quite afford. But it had one thing that changed Ethan's life forever. It had an upright piano. The piano was ancient and out of tune, Several keys stuck when you pressed them, and a few didn't make any sound at all. The wood was scratched and faded, and someone had carved their initials into one side decades ago. But to Ethan, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. One day, after the service had ended and most people had gone home, Ethan walked up to the piano and pressed one of the keys. The sound that came out was thin and slightly off pitch, but something inside Ethan's chest resonated with that note. He pressed another key, then another, listening to how they sounded together. Pastor James, a kind older man with gray hair and gentle eyes, noticed Ethan at the piano instead of scolding him for touching it. The pastor walked over and sat down on the bench beside him. "Do you want to learn to play?" son Pastor James asked. Ethan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "This old piano isn't much, but it works well enough. You can come here and practice whenever you want. I'll even show you a few things I remember from when I was young." That was how it started. Ethan began going to the church every day after school. He would do his homework in one of the pews, and then he would practice on the old piano until dinner time. Pastor James taught him the basics, showing him where middle C was and how to read simple sheet music. But Ethan wanted to learn more than Pastor James could teach him. So he started going to the public library and using their computers to watch piano tutorial videos online. He found free sheet music on websites and printed it out on the library's printer. He learned about famous pianists and composers, spending hours watching performances on the library's old desktop computers. The piano at the church became Ethan's refuge when kids at school made fun of him. He would think about the piano waiting for him. When money was tight at home and he could see the worry on his mother's face, he would go to the church and lose himself in music. The piano had 75 keys instead of the standard 88, and at least 10 of them either stuck or didn't work properly. But Ethan learned to work around the broken keys, adapting his playing to avoid the dead spots. For years, Ethan practiced in obscurity. He played for himself and occasionally for the small church congregation on Sunday mornings. He never imagined that his playing could take him anywhere beyond his small town. Music was just something beautiful in a life that often felt very hard. But then, during his junior year of high school, his music teacher, Mrs. Henderson, pulled him aside after class one day. She had heard him playing in the school's practice room and had been quietly amazed by his talent. "Ethan," she said, her voice serious, "you have a real gift. Have you ever thought about studying music professionally?" Ethan had laughed at the suggestion. "Mrs. Henderson, my family can barely afford groceries. How could I possibly go to music school?" But Mrs. Henderson was persistent. She told him about Eastwood Classical Academy and their scholarship program. Every year, they offered 5 full scholarships to talented students who couldn't afford tuition. The scholarships covered everything, including room, board, instruments, and lessons. "It's incredibly competitive," Mrs. Chatterjee Henderson warned. Hundreds of students auditioned for those 5 spots. "But Ethan, I really think you should try. I've been teaching music for 20 years, and I've never heard a student play with the emotion and natural ability that you have." That night, Ethan told his mother about the scholarship. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, not from sadness, but from a complex mixture of pride and fear. She was proud that her son had such talent and such dreams. She was afraid of getting his hopes up only to have them crushed. "Baby," she said, holding his face in her work-worn hands. "If this is what you want, then we'll find a way to make it happen, even if you don't get the scholarship. At least you'll have tried. That's worth something all by itself." Pastor James helped Ethan fill out the application. Together, they chose which pieces he would perform for the audition. Pastor James suggested some safer, more traditional choices, but Ethan had his heart set on something bigger. "I want to play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, Ethan announced. Pastor James's face went pale. "Son, that's one of the most difficult pieces ever written for piano. Even professional concert pianists find it challenging. Are you sure you're ready for something like that?" But Ethan was determined. He had first heard the piece on one of the library computers, and it had moved him to tears. The music spoke of struggle and triumph, of beauty rising from hardship. It was his story, his life, expressed in notes and chords. If he was going to audition for the most important opportunity of his life, he was going to play the piece that meant everything to him for the next 6 months. Ethan practiced that concerto every single day. He worked his part-time job at the grocery store, stocking shelves and bagging groceries to save money for the trip to the academy. His mother picked up extra shifts at the diner. Slowly, painfully, they saved enough money for gas and for the application fee. The drive to Eastwood Academy took 7 hours. Ethan and his mother left at 4 in the morning, driving through the mountains as the sun rose over the hills. Their old Honda Civic rattled and wheezed, and Sarah kept nervously checking the temperature gauge, praying the car wouldn't overheat. As they got closer to the city, the landscape changed. The mountains and forests gave way to suburbs and then to the urban sprawl of the metropolitan area where the academy was located. Ethan pressed his face against the window, watching buildings get taller and more impressive. When they finally pulled into the parking lot of Eastwood Classical Academy, Ethan's jaw dropped. The building looked like something from a movie. It was a massive structure with white columns and intricate architectural details. The grounds were immaculately maintained, with perfectly trimmed hedges and flower gardens that looked like they belonged in a magazine. Students walked across the campus carrying instrument cases that probably cost more than Ethan's car. Everyone looked confident and polished, like they belonged in this world of classical music and high culture. Sarah squeezed Ethan's hand. "You belong here just as much as any of them do," she said firmly. "Don't you forget that?" But as Ethan walked into the building, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was an imposter. The interior was even more impressive than the outside. The floors were polished marble. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings. Oil paintings of famous composers lined the walls. Everything echoed when he walked, making him feel like he should whisper. He found the waiting room for auditions and checked in with a woman at the desk. She barely glanced at him as she took his name and handed him a number. 37. He was number 37 out of probably 100 students auditioning that day. The waiting room was filled with students and their parents. Ethan sat down in one of the chairs and immediately felt every eye in the room assess and dismiss him. He watched other students warm up, their fingers moving through complex exercises with practiced ease. They talked about their private instructors and their summer programs at prestigious music festivals. One girl, who introduced herself to another student as Madison Hartley, was particularly impressive. She wore a dress that probably cost more than Ethan's family made in a month. Her blonde hair was styled perfectly, and she spoke with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. "I'll be performing selections from Chopin and Liszt," Madison announced to the room at large. "I've been studying with Professor Goldstein in New York for the past 5 years. He thinks I'm ready for the conservatory level program." Other students chimed in with their own credentials. Summer programs in Vienna, performances at Carnegie Hall, first place in youth competitions, private lessons from famous instructors whose names Ethan had only read about in books. Ethan said nothing. He had no impressive credentials to share, no famous teacher, no competition wins. Just thousands of hours practicing alone on a broken piano in a small church that most of these people would probably never even visit. "What about you?" a boy asked, looking at Ethan with curiosity. "Where do you study?" Ethan felt his face flush. "I teach myself mostly, and I get some help from my pastor." The room went quiet for a moment, then someone suppressed a laugh. Madison raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Self-taught," she repeated. "And you're auditioning here?" Before Ethan could respond, another student's name was called. A tall boy with perfect posture walked into the audition room. Through the walls, Ethan could hear him playing. He was good, very good. His technique was flawless, every note precise and controlled. When the boy came out 15 minutes later, he looked satisfied. "That went well," he told his parents. One by one, students were called. Some came out smiling, and others looked worried or upset. Ethan tried not to think about what was waiting for him behind that door. He tried not to think about Dr. Victoria Brennan, the director of the academy, whose reputation for being harsh and uncompromising was legendary in the classical music world. As he waited, Ethan thought about his journey to this moment. He thought about his father, who had loved music and used to hum while he worked around their small trailer. He thought about his mother, sitting in their old car in the parking lot right now, probably praying and hoping. He thought about Pastor James, who had believed in him when no one else did. This audition wasn't just about him. It was about showing everyone who had ever underestimated him that he was capable of more than they imagined. It was about proving that talent didn't only come from privilege and expensive training. It was about honoring all the sacrifices his mother had made. As he waited, Ethan's mind drifted back to the first time he had heard Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. He had been at the library, randomly clicking through classical music performances, when he stumbled across a recording of a famous pianist playing the piece with a full orchestra. From the very first notes, Ethan had been transfixed. The music began softly, almost hesitantly, like someone gathering courage to speak. Then it built into something powerful and overwhelming, full of passion and longing. The melody was heartbreakingly beautiful, and the technical demands of the piece were staggering. Ethan had listened to that recording 5 times in a row that day. He had gone home and told his mother that he had found the most beautiful piece of music he had ever heard. That night, he dreamed about playing it himself. When he told Pastor James that he wanted to learn the concerto, the old man had been concerned. "Ethan," Pastor James had said gently, "that piece is extraordinarily difficult. The hand stretches alone are nearly impossible for most pianists. You need a span of at least a tenth, sometimes more. And the technique required for the faster passages takes years to develop. But Ethan had unusually large hands for his age. His fingers were long and flexible, able to stretch across the keys in ways that even surprised Pastor James. And Ethan had something else. He had determination born from years of feeling like he had to prove himself worthy. For 6 months, Ethan had lived and breathed that concerto. He broke it down into small sections, learning each one until he could play it in his sleep. The broken keys on the church piano meant he had to memorize which notes to avoid and find creative ways to work around them. In some ways, that made him an even better pianist. He learned to adapt, to problem solve, to make music despite limitations. The hardest part had been learning without ever hearing himself play the piece properly. The church piano was so out of tune that the beautiful harmonies of Rachmaninoff's composition sounded muddy and wrong. Ethan had to imagine what it would sound like on a real piano, a properly tuned instrument that could do justice to the composer's vision. Now, sitting in this waiting room, Ethan wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. Maybe he should have chosen something easier and safer. Maybe he was being ridiculously arrogant, thinking he could perform one of the most difficult piano pieces ever written after only 6 months of practice on a broken instrument. But it was too late to change his mind now. He'd committed to this path, and he would see it through. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the woman with the clipboard appeared at the door and called his name. Ethan Miller. Ethan's heart leapt into his throat. This was it. This was the moment that would determine his entire future. He stood up, his legs shaky, and walked toward the audition room. Behind him, he heard whispers from the other students. "Who's that? I don't know. He doesn't look like he belongs here. Did you hear him say he taught himself?" Ethan pretended not to hear. He took a deep breath and pushed open the door to the audition room. The space was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling windows let in floods of natural light. In the center of the room sat the most magnificent piano Ethan had ever seen. It was a Steinway Model D concert grand, the same kind used in the world's greatest concert halls. The black lacquer finish gleamed in the sunlight, and Ethan could see his reflection in its polished surface. But he barely had time to admire the instrument because his attention was immediately drawn to the 3 people sitting behind a long table facing the piano. The woman in the middle was clearly Dr. Victoria Brennan. Ethan recognized her from photos he had seen online. She was in her early 50s with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore an expensive black suit and gold-framed glasses. Her face was composed into an expression of professional neutrality, but her eyes were sharp and evaluating. To her left sat Dr. Marcus Reed, a younger man with a beard and a more casual demeanor. To her right was Ms. Helen Cross, an older woman with white hair and kind eyes. Dr. Brennan looked down at the papers in front of her, then back up at Ethan. Her gaze traveled from his worn sneakers up to his wrinkled shirt, and Ethan saw her lips pressed together slightly. "Ethan Miller," Dr. Brennan said, pronouncing his name with careful precision. "Age 17. From West Virginia." The way she said West Virginia made it sound like a foreign country. Someplace distant and slightly distasteful. "Yes. Ma'am." Ethan said, and immediately regretted it. His accent, which he tried so hard to minimize at school, became more pronounced when he was nervous. He heard the rural inflection in his voice and knew that Dr. Brennan heard it too. "Tell me about your musical training," Dr. Brennan said. "It says here that you're self-taught, mostly." "Yes, ma'am. I've been learning piano for about 8 years. I practice at my local church, and Pastor James has helped teach me the fundamentals. I've also studied extensively using online resources and library books." Dr. Brennan's eyebrows rose slightly. "Online resources," she repeated. "YouTube tutorials?" I presume Ethan felt his face grow hot. "Some of them, yes. But also master classes and recorded performances from professional pianists. I study their technique and try to incorporate what I learn." "And where exactly do you practice?" Dr. Brennan asked. "Surely not on an actual piano." "Given your circumstances?" The way she said circumstances felt like an insult. Ethan forced himself to stay calm. "I practice on an upright piano at the Baptist church in my town. It's not in perfect condition, but it works." Dr. Reed, the younger judge, leaned forward. "How many keys does the piano have?" 75. Ethan admitted. "Some of them don't work properly." Dr. Brennan actually laughed. It wasn't a warm laugh. It was cold and mocking. 75 keys, some of which don't work, and you think you're prepared to audition for Eastwood Classical Academy, Ms.? Cross looked uncomfortable, like she wanted to say something. But Dr. Brennan continued before she could speak. "Mr. Miller," Dr. Brennan said, leaning back in her chair and folding her arms. "We get dozens of students like you every year. Students who think that passion and natural ability are enough. Students who believe that wanting something badly enough somehow entitles them to it. Let me be very clear with you. Classical music at this level requires more than enthusiasm. It requires years of proper training, access to quality instruments, and guidance from experienced professionals. What you're describing sounds like a hobbyist's preparation at best." Ethan felt like he had been slapped. He hadn't even played yet. And Dr. Brennan had already decided he wasn't good enough. "I understand that I don't have the traditional background that most of your students have," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady, "but I've worked very hard to prepare for this audition. If you'll give me a chance to play, I think you'll see that I'm serious about music." Dr. Brennan sighed, like she was already bored with this conversation. "Fine. What pieces have you prepared for us today?" Ethan swallowed hard. "I've prepared Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, the first movement." The room went completely silent. Dr. Reed's mouth fell open slightly. "Ms." Cross sat up straighter in her chair. Dr. Brennan stared at Ethan like he had just announced he could fly. "I'm sorry," Dr. Brennan said slowly. "Did you just say Rachmaninoff's second piano concerto, yes?" "Ma'am?" "The first movement?" Dr. Brennan stood up from her chair. She walked slowly toward the piano, her heels clicking on the polished floor. When she spoke again, her voice was dripping with condescension. "Mr. Miller, do you have any idea what you're saying? Rachmaninoff's second piano concerto is one of the most technically demanding pieces in the entire piano repertoire. It requires a hand span that most pianists don't have. The passages are so complex that professionals practice for years before attempting to perform it in public. And you think that you, a self-taught boy from West Virginia who practices on a broken church piano. Can play it. I've been working on it for 6 months, Ethan said quietly. I know it's difficult, but I'm ready. Dr. Brennan actually laughed out loud. 6 months? She turned to the other judges. Can you believe this 6 months of practice on a 75-key piano with broken keys? And he thinks he can play Rachmaninoff. Dr. Reed looked sympathetic. Perhaps, he suggested gently. You might want to choose something else, something more appropriate for your level of training. But Ethan shook his head. This is the piece I've prepared. This is what I want to play. Dr. Brennan walked closer to the piano. She placed one hand on its gleaming surface almost possessively. This piano, she said, is a Steinway Model D concert grand. It costs more than most people's houses. Every key is perfectly weighted and voiced. The sound is pure and resonant in ways that you cannot possibly imagine if you've only played on cheap upright pianos. This instrument is meant for serious musicians who have trained their entire lives to be worthy of touching it. She turned back to Ethan, and her expression was a mixture of pity and contempt. I'll tell you what, Mr. Miller, since you're so confident in your abilities, I'll make you a deal. You say you can play real piano, not just press keys on a broken toy. If you can actually perform Rachmaninoff's Concerto at a level that demonstrates genuine musical understanding and technical proficiency, if you can show me that you belong in the same room as this magnificent instrument, then I will do something I've never done before in my 30 years of teaching. She paused for a dramatic effect, and a cruel smile played at the corners of her mouth. If you can truly play piano, if you can prove that all my assumptions about you are wrong, then I will get down on my knees right here in this room and apologize for underestimating you. Dr. Reed gasped. Victoria. That's not necessary, he protested. No. Dr. Brennan interrupted him. I mean it. If this boy can play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, truly play it with the skill and artistry it demands, then I will kneel before him and admit that I was wrong. She walked back to her chair and sat down, her arms crossed, her expression challenging. So please, Mr. Miller, show us this miraculous performance. Show us how a self-taught pianist from Appalachia can perform one of the most difficult pieces in classical music. I'm very interested to see how this turns out. Ethan stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of her mockery. He could hear the other students in the waiting room beyond the door. If he failed now, if he couldn't deliver on the promise he had made by choosing this piece, the story would spread. Everyone would know. The hillbilly boy who thought he could play Rachmaninoff. The poor kid who didn't know his place. But something else was building inside Ethan alongside the fear. It was anger. Not hot, explosive anger, but something colder and more focused. Anger at being dismissed before he had even tried. Anger at the assumption that his background determined his worth. Anger at all the people in his life who had underestimated him because of where he came from and how he talked. He thought about his mother, sitting in that old car in the parking lot, probably praying for him right now. He thought about his father, who had died in a mine because they didn't have better options in their town. He thought about Pastor James, who had spent countless hours teaching him because he believed talent deserved to be nurtured regardless of circumstances. Ethan walked to the piano and sat down on the bench. He adjusted the height until his feet could reach the pedals comfortably. He placed his hands on the keys and felt their weight. They were different from the church piano, heavier and more responsive, but they felt right under his fingers. He looked up at Dr. Brennan one more time. She was still smiling that cruel smile, confident that she was about to witness an embarrassing failure. "Are you ready, Mr. Miller?" she asked with false sweetness. "Please take your time. I'm sure this performance will be very educational for all of us." Ethan turned back to the piano. He closed his eyes and took 3 slow breaths. In his mind, he heard the opening notes of the concerto. He remembered why he loved this piece, what it meant to him. It was a story of struggle and triumph, of beauty emerging from hardship. It was his story, and he was ready to tell it. Ethan placed his fingers on the keys and pressed the first chord. The sound that emerged from the Steinway was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was rich and deep and full, resonating through the room and through his entire body. That single chord contained more beauty than anything he had ever coaxed from the church piano. For a moment, he just sat there, letting that sound wash over him. Then he began to play. The opening of Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto starts quietly, almost tentatively. Deep, rolling chords in the left hand create a foundation while the right hand introduces a melody that is both melancholy and hopeful. Ethan's fingers found the notes with absolute certainty, and the piano responded to his touch like it was singing. Behind him, Dr. Brennan still wore that smug expression. She had heard hundreds of auditions, and she knew what real talent sounded like. She was prepared to hear a mediocre attempt at a piece far beyond this boy's abilities. She would let him play for a minute or two, then stop him and suggest he reconsider his musical aspirations. But as the opening measures unfolded, something changed in the room. The quality of the sound, the way Ethan shaped each phrase, the depth of emotion he brought to even these quiet opening notes. It was different from what Dr. Brennan had expected. Dr. Reed leaned forward in his chair, his attention fully captured. "Ms." Cross's eyes widened slightly. Ethan was no longer aware of the judges. He wasn't thinking about Dr. Brennan's mockery or the other students in the waiting room. He was inside the music now, and nothing else existed. The melody began to build, moving through the exposition with increasing complexity. Ethan's left hand played accompaniment patterns that required perfect rhythmic precision, while his right hand carried the gorgeous, soaring melody. His fingers stretched across the keys, reaching intervals that many pianists couldn't manage. But his unusually large hands, the hands that had sometimes made him self-conscious, were perfect for this music. The sound filled the enormous audition room. It bounced off the high ceilings and the tall windows, creating a resonance that was almost orchestral. Ethan could feel the music, not just hear it. He could feel it in his chest, in his bones, in the way his breath moved. As he played, memories flooded through him. He remembered being 9 years old and touching the church piano for the first time. He remembered his father's funeral, the way the organ had played, and how he had wished he could make music like that. He remembered his mother crying in their trailer when she thought he was asleep, worried about money, worried about their future. He remembered practicing until his hands ached, determined to transform those struggles into something beautiful. All of that emotion poured into his playing. This wasn't just technical proficiency, though his technique sure was flawless. This was music that came from somewhere deep inside, from a place of authentic human experience and feeling. Behind him, Dr. Brennan's smug smile had begun to fade. Her eyes narrowed as she listened more carefully. This wasn't what she had expected. Not at all. The music moved into more complex territory. Ethan's hands began to move faster, executing runs and arpeggios that required years of practice to master. His fingers flew across the keyboard with precision and confidence. Every note was perfectly placed, perfectly timed. Miss Cross found herself holding her breath. She had been teaching piano for 40 years, and she recognized extraordinary playing when she heard it. This boy, this unlikely candidate from the mountains, was performing at a level that exceeded many of their current advanced students. The piece demanded more and more from the pianist. Octave passages where both hands had to move in parallel, spanning wide intervals, rapid chromatic runs that tested the limits of finger independence, complex rhythmic patterns that required absolute precision. Ethan executed all of it with an ease that seemed almost impossible. Dr. Reed pulled out his phone and started recording, though he kept it discreet. He had a feeling that he was witnessing something remarkable, something he would want to remember. The music told a story, and Ethan knew that story by heart. It spoke of longing and loss. It spoke of hope struggling against despair. It spoke of the human spirit refusing to be broken by hardship. Every phrase had meaning. Every dynamic change served the emotional arc of the composition. Ethan's hands moved across the piano like they had always belonged there. The Steinway responded to his every touch, producing sounds of crystalline clarity and emotional depth. The church piano had never sounded like this. It had never been capable of this kind of beauty. For the first time, Ethan was hearing his own playing the way it was meant to sound, and it filled him with a joy so intense it was almost painful. Dr. Brennan sat frozen in her chair. The condescending smile had completely disappeared from her face. She was staring at Ethan with an expression of shocked disbelief. Everything she had assumed about this boy, everything she had been so certain of, was proving to be completely wrong. The technical demands of what Ethan was doing were extraordinary. The hand stretches, the speed, the coordination required to keep multiple melodic lines distinct. These were things that professional pianists struggled with. Yet this 17-year-old boy was executing them flawlessly. But technique alone wouldn't have affected Dr. Brennan this way. She had heard plenty of technically proficient performances. What was getting to her? What was making her chest feel tight and her eyes start to sting? Was the emotion in Ethan's playing? He wasn't just playing the notes. He was living them. The concerto moved into a section of profound beauty. This was where Rachmaninoff had poured all of his own longing and heartbreak into the music. The melody was so gorgeous, so filled with aching emotion, that it had moved audiences to tears for over a century. Ethan played it like he was speaking to someone he loved. Each note was chosen with care, each phrase shaped with intention. His right hand sang the melody while his left hand created a shimmering accompaniment that was like a conversation, like the music was answering itself. In the waiting room outside, every student had stopped talking. They could hear the music through the walls, muffled but unmistakable. Some of them recognized the piece. They knew how difficult it was. A few of them had tried to learn sections of it with their expensive teachers and had given up because it was beyond their abilities. "Who is playing that?" Madison whispered to another student. "I think it's the boy, the one in the old sneakers." "That's impossible. Nobody our age can play like that." But it wasn't impossible. It was happening right now, in this room, performed by a boy they had dismissed without a second thought. Back in the audition room, Miss Cross had tears running down her cheeks. She wasn't even trying to hide them. The music was so beautiful, performed with such sincerity and skill, that it reached past all her professional defenses and touched something deep in her heart. Dr. Reed had stopped taking notes. He was completely absorbed in the performance, his critical faculties suspended by the sheer power of what he was hearing. And Dr. Brennan, Dr. Victoria Brennan, who prided herself on never showing emotion, who had built her reputation on being tough and uncompromising, felt her carefully constructed composure cracking. Her throat was tight. Her eyes were burning with unshed tears. Her hands, folded on the table in front of her, were trembling slightly. She thought about all the students she had taught over the years, the ones from wealthy families who had every advantage, the ones with famous teachers and expensive instruments. Many of them had been very good. A few had been excellent. But she couldn't remember the last time a student had moved her the way this boy was moving her right now. Ethan transitioned into a technically challenging passage that required both hands to play rapid, ascending runs in opposite directions simultaneously. It was the kind of passage that made even professional pianists nervous. He executed it perfectly, his hands crossing over each other in a blur of motion, every note crisp and clear. The music built toward a climactic moment, one of the emotional peaks of the entire concerto. Ethan played it with such passion and intensity that the piano seemed to roar. The sound filled every corner of the huge room, powerful and overwhelming. Then, just as suddenly, the music became soft again, almost whisper quiet. This was one of the most difficult aspects of the piece, the ability to shift from thunderous power to delicate tenderness in an instant. Many pianists struggled with these sudden dynamic changes, but Ethan navigated them with perfect control, his touch so refined that he could draw the most delicate sounds from the instrument when needed. The performance was approaching its climactic section. This was where the technical and emotional demands of the piece reached their peak. The pianist had to play passages of incredible complexity while maintaining the emotional through line of the music. It was exhausting, both physically and mentally. Ethan's face showed the intensity of his concentration. His brow was furrowed, and he was completely absorbed in the music. Every muscle in his body was engaged, from his fingers on the keys to his feet on the pedals, to the subtle movements of his shoulders and back that helped him generate the power needed for the loudest passages. The music spoke of struggle, of fighting against overwhelming odds. It spoke of determination and resilience. It spoke of refusing to be defeated, no matter how impossible things seemed. Ethan understood these themes in his bones. He had lived them every day of his life. As he played, he thought about every person who had ever told him to be realistic, every teacher who had suggested he focus on something more practical than music, every classmate who had mocked his dreams, every moment when he had felt like giving up because the obstacles were too great. All of that was in his playing. All of that struggle and determination and refusal to quit poured out through his fingers and into Rachmaninoff's notes, transforming them from marks on a page into something living and powerful. Dr. Brennan felt like she couldn't breathe. She had been so certain that this audition would be a disaster, that this presumptuous boy would embarrass himself, and she would be justified in her harsh words. Instead, she was witnessing one of the finest performances she had heard in years, and it was coming from the student she had been most ready to dismiss. The realization hit her like a physical blow. How many other students had she underestimated over the years? How many talented young people had she overlooked? Because they didn't fit her narrow definition of what a classical musician should look like. How much genuine artistry had she missed? Because she was too focused on credentials and pedigree. The music reached a section that required Ethan to play massive, thundering chords with both hands. The sound was so powerful that it seemed to shake the floor. His hands came down on the keys with perfect timing, perfect force, creating a wall of sound that was both beautiful and overwhelming. Then, in an instant, the music shifted again, quiet, contemplative, almost fragile. Ethan's touch became feather-light, drawing sounds from the piano that were barely above a whisper. The contrast was stunning, and it demonstrated a level of control that took most pianists decades to develop. In the waiting room, students were pulling out their phones, trying to record the music they were hearing through the walls. They knew they were witnessing something special, something that would become a story they would tell for years. "Did you see his sneakers?" someone whispered. "They looked like they came from a thrift store." "Who cares about his sneakers?" Someone else responded. "Listen to him play. Just listen." The performance was approaching its conclusion. This was where everything came together, where all the themes and emotions of the piece would be resolved in a final, overwhelming statement. Ethan's hands moved faster than seemed humanly possible. His fingers flew across the keyboard, executing passages of such complexity that they sounded like multiple pianos playing simultaneously. The music built and built, growing in intensity and power, heading toward the final climactic moment. Ms. Cross was openly crying now. She had given up any pretense of professional objectivity. This was beyond professionalism. This was art in its purest form, and it was being created by a 17-year-old boy who had every reason to have given up on his dreams, but who had persisted anyway. Dr. Reed's recording hand was shaking. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He taught at Eastwood, worked with talented students every day, and he had never heard anything like this from someone so young with so little formal training. Dr. Brennan felt something break inside her. It wasn't just about this performance, though that was part of it. It was about every assumption she had made, every prejudice she had held, every time she judged someone based on their background instead of their actual abilities. She had been wrong. Profoundly, completely wrong. The music reached its peak. Ethan played the final passages with such passion and skill that it felt like the piano itself might explode from the intensity. His whole body was involved in the performance. He swayed with the music, his face showing every emotion the piece contained. This was why he played. This was why he had spent thousands of hours practicing on that broken church piano. This was why he had endured the mockery and the skepticism and the constant feeling of being an outsider. Because music could do this. It could transform struggle into beauty. It could take pain and longing and hope and weave them into something transcendent. The final section of the movement was upon him now. This was the moment that would bring everything to its conclusion. Ethan gathered every bit of strength and emotion he had left and channeled it into these final measures. His hands moved across the entire range of the keyboard, from the deepest bass notes to the highest treble. He pulled every possible sound from the magnificent instrument. The Steinway responded like it was grateful to finally be played by someone who truly understood what it could do. The music was simultaneously triumphant and bittersweet. It spoke of victories that came at great cost, of dreams achieved through sacrifice, of beauty that emerged from struggle. Ethan played it with complete understanding, because he knew exactly what those things felt like. The final chord was approaching. Ethan could feel it coming. The moment when all of this would culminate in one last, powerful statement. He raised his hands, gathering himself for this final gesture. Then he brought both hands down on the keys with perfect timing and absolute conviction. The sound that emerged was enormous, filling every inch of the audition room and probably echoing through the entire building. It was the sound of victory, of validation, of a dream refused to die. The chord rang out, sustained by the piano's resonance and by Ethan's careful use of the sustain pedal. It seemed to last forever, gradually fading into silence. And then it was over. Complete silence filled the audition room. Ethan sat at the piano, his hands still on the keys, breathing heavily. He had just played for nearly 20 minutes, pouring everything he had into Rachmaninoff's masterpiece. His heart was pounding. His hands were shaking slightly from exhaustion and adrenaline. Behind him, the three judges sat completely still, unable to move or speak. They had just witnessed something that none of them had expected, something that challenged everything they thought they knew about music education and talent development. Dr. Brennan stared at Ethan's back with an expression of utter shock. Her face was pale, and tears were running down her cheeks, though she seemed unaware of them. Her carefully applied makeup was smudged, and she didn't care. Dr. Reed's mouth was hanging open. He had stopped recording at some point, too absorbed in the performance to remember he was holding his phone. Ms. Cross had her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming freely down her face. The silence stretched on. 30 seconds. A minute. Ethan finally turned around on the piano bench to face the judges. He looked nervous again, uncertain about what would happen next. "I'm sorry if I made mistakes," Ethan said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know it's a very difficult piece, and I'm still working on some sections." His words seemed to break whatever spell had frozen the room. Dr. Reed let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Mistakes," he said, his voice cracking. "You're asking about mistakes, Miss." Cross shook her head, unable to speak through her tears. "Dr." Brennan tried to stand up, but her legs wouldn't support her at first. She gripped the edge of the table and tried again. This time she managed to get to her feet. Though she looked unsteady, she stared at Ethan for a long moment, and he could see emotions warring on her face. Shock, disbelief, shame, and something else that might have been wonder. Dr. Brennan walked slowly toward the piano. Each step seemed difficult, like she was fighting against something inside herself. Ethan watched her approach and felt a flutter of fear. Was she angry? Had he done something wrong? But when Dr. Brennan spoke, her voice was completely different from before. The mockery and condescension were gone. In their place was something raw and honest. "Mr. Miller," she said, and her voice broke on his name. That was. She stopped, struggling to find words. I have been teaching and judging piano performances for 30 years. I have heard thousands of auditions. I have attended concerts by the world's greatest pianists. And what you just played, she paused again, swallowing hard, was one of the most beautiful, most moving performances I have ever experienced. Ethan's eyes widened in surprise. Before you played, Dr. Brennan continued, I made a promise, a cruel promise, meant to humiliate you. I said that if you could truly play piano, if you could prove me wrong, then I would kneel. She looked back at the other judges, then back at Ethan. I made that promise because I was absolutely certain you would fail. I judged you based on your clothes, your accent, where you're from, and how you learned. I assumed that real talent could only come from privilege and expensive training and formal education. Dr. Brennan's voice grew stronger, more determined. I was wrong, completely, utterly, shamefully wrong. You have just proven that genuine artistry can emerge from anywhere, from any circumstances. If the talent and dedication are there, then slowly and deliberately. Victoria Brennan lowered herself to her knees in front of Ethan Miller. The gesture was shocking. This powerful woman, the director of one of the most prestigious music academies in the country, was kneeling before a 17-year-old boy from the mountains of West Virginia. I kneel before your talent, Dr. Brennan said, her voice thick with emotion. I kneel before your dedication and your artistry, and I kneel to ask for your forgiveness for the way I treated you, for the assumptions I made, and for almost letting my prejudices rob me of the chance to hear something truly extraordinary. Ethan felt tears welling up in his own eyes. He slid off the piano bench and knelt down too. So they were at the same level. Dr. Brennan, he said softly, you don't need to ask for forgiveness. I understand why you thought what you did. I know I don't look like your other students. I know my background is different. That's exactly the point, Dr. Brennan said, tears streaming down her face. Your background shouldn't matter. Your clothes shouldn't matter. What should matter, what does matter, is what you just showed us. You have a gift that transcends all of those superficial things. Behind them, Dr. Reed and Ms. Cross had both stood up. Dr. Reed started clapping. Slowly at first, then faster. Ms. Cross joined him. The sound of their applause filled the audition room. Outside, students had been listening at the door. When they heard the applause, one of them carefully pushed the door open just a crack. What they saw? The famous Dr. Brennan on her knees, in front of the boy they had dismissed, would become the story that spread through the entire school and beyond. Dr. Brennan and Ethan both stood up. The director composed herself. wiping her tears and trying to regain some semblance of professional dignity. Though her eyes were still red and her face was blotchy from crying. "Mr. Miller," she said formally, "on behalf of Eastwood Classical Academy, I would like to offer you a full scholarship to our program. Not just tuition," she added quickly, seeing his eyes light up. "Everything, room and board, books, instrument access, private lessons, everything you need to develop your extraordinary talent." Ethan felt like his heart might burst. The scholarship. He had actually earned it. All those years of practice, all those hours in the church, all the sacrifices his mother had made. They had led to this moment. But Dr. Brennan wasn't finished. "More than that," she said, "I would like to personally oversee your musical education. I want to help you refine your technique, expand your repertoire, and prepare you for a career as a professional pianist. If you'll allow me to teach you, despite how poorly I treated you today." Ethan could barely speak. "I would be honored," he managed to say. Dr. Reed walked over and shook Ethan's hand enthusiastically. "That was truly remarkable," he said. "I can't wait to work with you." "Ms." Cross hugged Ethan, something she almost never did with students. "You have given me a gift today," she said. "You've reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place." The door to the audition room opened wider, and students began filing in. Madison Hartley, who had been so confident about her own audition earlier, walked up to Ethan with genuine admiration in her eyes. "That was incredible," she said. "I've been taking lessons since I was 4 years old, and I couldn't play like that. You're amazing." Other students crowded around, offering congratulations and asking questions. The boy who had been invisible to them an hour ago was now the center of attention, and their attitudes had completely changed. Ethan excused himself as politely as he could and ran out of the building. His mother was still sitting in their old Honda Civic in the parking lot, her head bowed in prayer. She had been praying for the entire hour that Ethan had been inside. When she heard footsteps running toward the car, she looked up, her face anxious and hopeful. Ethan was grinning wider than she had ever seen him grin. He yanked open the car door and practically shouted, "I got it, Mom, I got the full scholarship." Sarah Miller's hands flew to her mouth. She started crying immediately, big sobs of relief and joy. She pulled Ethan into the car and hugged him so tightly he could barely breathe. "Tell me everything," she said. "What happened?" So Ethan told her. He told her about Dr. Brennan's mockery, about the promise to kneel, about playing the Rachmaninoff on the most beautiful piano he had ever touched. He told her about Dr. Brennan actually kneeling, about the tears and the applause and the scholarship offer that included everything they needed. Sarah cried through the entire story. These weren't tears of sadness or stress, like the ones Ethan had heard through the walls of their trailer. These were tears of pure joy and pride and relief that all their struggles had been worth it. "Your daddy would be so proud," she whispered. "I wish he could see you now." "I think he can, Mama," Ethan said. "I think he's been watching all along." They sat in that old car in the parking lot of Eastwood Classical Academy and cried and laughed together. Around them, students and their wealthy parents came and went, some stopping to stare at the old Honda and the emotional scene inside. But Ethan and Sarah didn't care. They had achieved something that had seemed impossible just that morning. As they prepared to drive home, Dr. Brennan came out of the building, She walked over to their car and tapped on the window. Sarah rolled it down nervously. "Mrs. Miller," Dr. Brennan said, "I wanted to introduce myself properly. I'm Dr. Victoria Brennan, director of Eastwood Academy. I also wanted to apologize to you for how I treated your son today. I judged him unfairly. I'm ashamed of my behavior." Sarah looked confused. She didn't fully understand what Dr. Brennan was apologizing for, but Ethan would explain everything on the long drive home. "Your son has a remarkable gift," Dr. Brennan continued. "And clearly, he gets his strength and determination from you. You should be very proud." "I am," Sarah said simply. "I always have been." Dr. Brennan handed a folder through the window. "This has all the scholarship information and enrollment materials, Gastadam. We'll be in touch soon about when Ethan should start. We'd like him here as soon as possible." As Dr. Brennan walked away, Sarah looked at her son with wonder. "What just happened?" she asked. Ethan smiled. "I think our lives just changed." "Mama, I think everything just changed." 3 months later, Ethan walked through the halls of Eastwood Classical Academy as a full-time student. And he still sometimes had to pinch himself to believe it was real. He had his own practice room now, with a beautiful Yamaha grand piano that he could use whenever he wanted. His room in the student dormitory was small but comfortable, nicer than anywhere he had ever lived. The cafeteria served 3 meals a day, and he never had to worry about whether there would be enough food. But the best part, better than the facilities or the comfort, was the music. Every day he was surrounded by talented students and world-class teachers. He was learning and growing faster than he ever had before. Dr. Brennan had kept her promise to mentor him personally every Tuesday and Thursday. He had private lessons with her in her office. The relationship between them had evolved into something neither of them expected. She wasn't just teaching him technique and repertoire. She was preparing him for a career, helping him understand the business of classical music and how to navigate it successfully. "You were right about one thing," Dr. Brennan told him during one lesson. "Talent alone isn't enough. But I was wrong to think it only came from privilege. True talent, the kind that changes lives, can emerge from anywhere. You've taught me that." Ethan had become friends with students he never thought would give him the time of day. Madison Hartley had asked him to help her improve her technique, and in exchange, she was helping him with music theory, an area where his self-taught education had left gaps. The video of his audition had gone viral. Someone had recorded Dr. Brennan kneeling, and it had been shared millions of times across social media. News outlets had picked up the story of the boy from Appalachia who had humbled the famous director with his extraordinary talent. But Ethan tried not to let the attention change who he was. He still called his mother every day. He still remembered where he came from and the struggles that had shaped him. Back home in West Virginia, things had improved for Sarah Miller too. The scholarship included a stipend for families, allowing her to cut back to just one job. She was taking online classes, working toward finishing her high school diploma that she had never completed. Eastwood Academy had established a new scholarship program specifically for talented students from rural areas and underprivileged backgrounds. Dr. Brennan personally oversaw the program, determined to ensure that no other gifted student would be overlooked because of their circumstances. Ethan visited home whenever he could. He played at his old church for Pastor James and the small congregation that had supported him for so many years. The old upright piano was still there, still broken and out of tune. But Ethan played it anyway. It would always hold a special place in his heart. Ethan's story became something bigger than just one boy's success. It became a reminder that talent exists everywhere, in small towns and big cities, in wealthy families and struggling ones, in traditional students and unconventional ones. Dr. Brennan often told the story of Ethan's audition to her students and colleagues. She spoke about it as the moment that changed her understanding of what music education should be. She had learned that a teacher's most important job wasn't to validate their own assumptions, but to recognize genuine talent wherever it appeared and nurture it without prejudice. For Ethan, the journey was just beginning. He had earned his place at Eastwood, but he knew that success in classical music required more than one amazing audition. It required years of continued work, dedication, and growth. But he had something that couldn't be taught in any academy. He had lived experience that informed his playing. He had known struggle and sacrifice and the kind of determination that comes from having no backup plan. When he played music about human suffering and triumph, he wasn't imagining those emotions. He had felt them every time he sat down at a piano. He remembered that day in the audition room. He remembered Dr. Brennan's cruel smile turning to tears. He remembered the feeling of proving everyone wrong who had ever doubted him. And he remembered his mother's face when he told her he had gotten the scholarship. Those memories kept him humble and hungry. They reminded him that talent was a gift, but it was also a responsibility. He had been given opportunities that many people from his background never received, and he was determined not to waste them. Ethan's dream was to eventually become a concert pianist, performing in the world's great concert halls. But he also wanted to teach, to mentor students who reminded him of himself, young people with raw talent but no resources or connections. He wanted to be living proof that where you start doesn't determine where you end up, that the most beautiful music can come from the most unexpected places, that sometimes the person who looks least likely to succeed is the one who will change everything.